The digital ecosystem is a two-edged sword where the cons has now been elevated to a global existential threat leading to loss of lives and livelihood. And there is a considerable list of threats to the information environment, including hate speech, fake news, algorithms manipulation, disinformation, misinformation, among others, affecting the political, health, and news domains. In response to these challenges, a group of over 200 scientists and others from around the world under the International Panel on the Information Environment IPIE did some studies and summarized global surveys in an initial report at the Nobel Prize Summit in Washington, D.C., USA, on effective ways to combat threats to the information environment after some peer review. A member of IPIE and chair of Research and Creation, School of Communications, Catholic University of Chile, Professor Sebastian Valenzuela, in a chat with Channels Television, explains the contextual variance of misinformation as an existential threat.
One of the things we're finding is that it's an existential threat in some particular topics, but not in others. So in health, for example, when it comes to vaccination against COVID-19, for example, there's been a plethora of studies finding that people who are more misinformed about the benefits or the risks of getting vaccinated are much more likely to not get the shot and eventually become more at risk in terms of getting the disease. But in other domains, such as politics, that's a more controversial area because a lot of the effects of political misinformation on, for example, voting depends on context. And that's one of the things that IPIE really wants to highlight.
It further annotates on the methodology used to propose most effective countermeasures to digital misinformation.
What we found with this qualitative and quantitative analysis of the literature was that two particular countermeasures seem to be effective, meaning we have sufficient scientific evidence to back them up, to say this seemed to work. One was providing corrections, which might be in the format of a fact check or some other type of format, but when you correct, when you expose people to a corrective message. And the other one was when social platforms use content labeling. So, for example, there's a post on Facebook or on Instagram saying, for example, that vaccines against COVID-19 are bad, which would be a misinformation. And then you have a content label there where it says, this content is disputed, or this content is false, or there's a label there.
Part of IPI's concern is how Western-centric the studies are, and the professor highlights reasons and what can be done in places like Africa.
You can track it to all sorts of disparities, educational disparities. The even platforms, for example, social media platforms provide much more data to scholars in some regions, but not in other regions. One of the things we want to highlight as an IPIE is precisely those disparities, those gaps. How to fix them? Well, first we have to recognize that scholars in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, we lack access to data. We lack access to human capital.
According to Professor Valenzuela, governments are more likely to fund research on climate change than studies on digital misinformation, perhaps because governments are primarily to blame for misinformation, even though it's as much of an existential threat like climate change.